Saruman didn't join Sauron. That's the simple answer. And it's wrong. What actually happened is darker and more interesting than a betrayal. Saruman spent centuries studying Sauron, reading his methods, mapping his strategies, trying to think like him in order to find the One Ring before anyone else could. And somewhere in those centuries, without fully realizing it, he stopped trying to think like Sauron and started actually becoming him. By the time he declared himself a power in his own right, he wasn't Sauron's ally. He was Sauron's most successful student, a copy so faithful that the original barely needed to do anything. This is the story of how the wisest man in Middle-earth became its most useful fool. Welcome back to Son of Odin, where we go deep into the lore the films never had the nerve to fully explain. Today we're pulling apart one of the most misunderstood characters in all of Tolkien, Saruman the White. What he was, what he wanted, and exactly how a being of immense power and ancient wisdom ended up serving the very evil he was sent to stop. By the end of this video, you'll understand that Saruman's fall isn't a story about weakness. It's a story about a very particular kind of corruption, the kind that comes from being too confident, too clever, and too convinced that you're the exception. What Saruman actually was. The films give you an old man in white robes with a staff. That image is accurate and almost entirely misleading. Saruman, his true name Kurunir, meaning man of skill, was a Maya, a being of the same order as Sauron himself. Not a god exactly, but something close. He existed before the world was made. He was present at its shaping. He had seen things that no human, elf, or dwarf had ever witnessed and could ever fully comprehend. When the Valar, the powers who governed the world, decided to send emissaries to Middle-earth to help its free peoples resist Sauron, they chose 5 Maiar and bound them into mortal forms. Aged bodies, limited power, forced to work through persuasion and guidance rather than raw divine strength. This was deliberate. The Valar had seen what happened when divine power tried to dominate Middle-earth directly. Morgoth, then Sauron. The answer was not more power from the outside. It was wisdom, quietly applied from within. The 5 emissaries were called the Istari, wizards. And of the 5, Saruman was the eldest and the greatest, chosen first. Robed in white, the highest of the order, given authority over the others. He arrived in Middle-earth around the year 1000 of the Third Age. Sauron had been quiet for centuries. The free peoples were prosperous and largely at peace. The threat was distant. The mission seemed manageable. It was not manageable, and Saruman, of all people, should have known that. Why he was sent to Middle-earth. The mission of the Istari was specific and deliberately constrained. They were not sent to fight Sauron directly. They were not sent to rule. They were not sent to replace one form of power with another. They were sent to inspire, to counsel, to help the free peoples of Middle-earth find the strength and wisdom to resist Sauron themselves. The Valar were explicit about one thing above all others. The Istari were forbidden to dominate, forbidden to use their power to bend others to their will, even in the service of good. The moment an Istari started thinking in terms of control, of making people do the right thing rather than helping them choose it, he had already begun to fail. Saruman understood this. In the early centuries, he was everything the mission required. Subtle, learned, endlessly curious about the peoples and histories of Middle-earth. He traveled widely. He listened more than he spoke. The elves respected him. Men sought his counsel. He built a reputation as the wisest living being in Middle-earth, and for a long time that reputation was entirely deserved. But Saruman was also, from the beginning, interested in a specific problem, one that would consume him for the rest of his existence. He wanted to understand rings of power, how they were made, how they worked, and most specifically, where the One Ring had gone after Sauron lost it in the War of the Last Alliance. This was legitimate scholarship at first, understanding the enemy's most dangerous weapon in order to counter it. That's exactly what a wise counselor should do. Saruman was the head of the White Council, the gathering of the wisest beings in Middle-earth. Studying the One Ring was part of his mandate. The problem was that studying it wasn't enough for him. He wanted it. The obsession with the One Ring. This is where the story gets complicated and dark. Saruman spent centuries, literally centuries, researching the One Ring. He studied Sauron's methods of ringcraft. He read everything written about the Rings of Power. He searched the histories of the Gladden Fields, where Isildur had been ambushed and the ring lost, trying to trace where it might have gone. And in doing all of this, he made a mistake that is almost poetic in its irony. To understand how the One Ring worked, he had to understand how Sauron thought. To understand how Sauron thought, he had to think like Sauron. To think like Sauron convincingly enough, over enough centuries, he had to adopt Sauron's logic at a fundamental level. Sauron's logic was this: power is the only thing that matters. Those who have it shape the world. Those who don't are shaped by it. The strong deserve to rule because they are strong. Order imposed by a superior will is better than the chaos of lesser minds making their own choices. Saruman told himself he was studying this logic in order to defeat it. But you cannot spend 500 years genuinely inhabiting a worldview without it changing you. Especially when, and this is crucial, you are a being of immense pride who has spent those same 500 years watching lesser minds make exactly the kind of disastrous choices that Sauron's logic predicts they will. By the time of the events of The Lord of the Rings, Saruman had quietly concluded that Sauron's logic was correct. He just believed that he, not Sauron, should be the one applying it. He began deceiving the White Council. When Gandalf pushed to drive Sauron from Dol Guldur, Saruman repeatedly delayed, not because he doubted it was necessary, but because he was secretly hoping Sauron's movements would flush out the One Ring. He wanted to find it first. He wanted the power for himself. He had stopped trying to defeat Sauron. He was trying to replace him. Orthanc and the Palantir. Saruman's base was Orthanc, the black tower at the center of Isengard, in the Circle of the Ents. He had been given it by the Council of Gondor as a stronghold from which to watch the passes of Rohan and guard against Sauron's movements in the south. What nobody knew, not the Council, not Gandalf, not the Valar, was that Orthanc contained a Palantir, one of the 7 seeing stones of Numenor, ancient artifacts of immense power that allowed their users to communicate across vast distances and see events happening far away. Saruman used it in secret. Alone in his tower, he looked into the Palantir and gathered intelligence about Sauron's movements, his forces, his plans. For years, this gave him a genuine advantage. He knew things nobody else knew. He could track Sauron's rebuilding of power in real time. He believed he was watching Sauron. He did not fully reckon with the possibility that Sauron was watching him back. The Palantiri were originally made by the elves of Numenor, but Sauron had captured one, the Ithil stone, when Minas Ithil fell in the Second Age, which meant that any communication through the Palantir network was potentially visible to him. Any mind that touched the stones could be read, influenced, manipulated by a sufficiently powerful will on the other end. And Sauron's will was the most powerful that had ever existed in Middle-earth. What happened next is not shown directly in the books. Tolkien leaves it deliberately ambiguous. But the shape of it is clear. At some point, looking into the Palantir, Saruman encountered Sauron's mind directly. And Sauron, who had spent his entire existence learning how to corrupt and dominate other wills, found in Saruman something he could work with. Not a servant. Not yet. Something more useful. An ally who still believed he was independent. A piece already positioned exactly where Sauron needed it to be. The point of no return. The exact moment Saruman crossed the line is not a dramatic scene. There is no confrontation, no bargain struck at midnight, no moment where he looks in the mirror and sees what he has become. That is precisely what makes it so effective as a story. By the time of the Fellowship of the Ring, when Gandalf arrives at Orthanc seeking counsel and is imprisoned in the tower, Saruman has already made his choice. He offers Gandalf a partnership. Together, he says, they could find the One Ring. Together, they could use its power to bring order to Middle-earth. Sauron could be overcome. The free peoples could be guided. Firmly, yes, but for their own good. Listen to the language. Guided firmly for their own good. That is not the mission he was given. That is not the wisdom of the Valar. That is Sauron's logic, dressed in white robes, speaking in the most reasonable voice imaginable. Gandalf refuses. And Saruman, who has spent centuries becoming a being who cannot tolerate being refused, imprisons him on the pinnacle of Orthanc and sends word to Sauron. That is the moment. Not a dramatic fall, a quiet administrative decision. Saruman simply closes a door that had been slowly swinging shut for 500 years. He didn't join Sauron because Sauron offered him something irresistible. He joined Sauron because he had already become the kind of being for whom Sauron's offer made perfect sense. The corruption wasn't external. It grew from inside, from pride, from obsession, from centuries of telling himself that he was smarter than everyone around him, and that the rules which applied to lesser minds didn't apply to him. He was the wisest being in Middle-earth. And wisdom, without humility, is just a more sophisticated path to the same destination as every other corrupted power in Tolkien's world. He became exactly what he was sent to prevent. Not because Sauron broke him, because he broke himself, slowly over centuries, one small compromise at a time. Saruman didn't betray Middle-earth in a moment of weakness. He arrived at betrayal through 500 years of being completely certain he was right. That's what makes him the most frightening villain in Tolkien's world. Not his power, not his armies, not Isengard. The fact that every step of his fall was logical, reasonable, justified by his own lights at every stage. The Valar sent the wisest being they had, and wisdom, turned inward, became the sharpest instrument of his own destruction. Next time, we stay in the Tolkien universe. There are more stories to tell. You can also check other videos on my YouTube channel, like my last video about Ashai. Have a good day.